Golf Central on YouTube is brought to you by the new Chrome Tour golf ball from Callaway.
There is some breaking news on this Friday. Brooks Koepka has applied for reinstatement of his PGA Tour membership. Let's welcome in Damon as we flesh this out. Damon, your reaction to Brooks Koepka filing for reinstatement?
No big surprise, Rich. There'd been some reporting and some rumblings over the last year or so that Brooks wasn't all that happy necessarily on LIV Golf. I think that we've seen over the last few years that, but for a handful of players, maybe Bryson DeChambeau most notably, a lot of the players that have gone to LIV have not kept up their competitive energies from when they were on the PGA Tour. I think Brooks Koepka is an example of that. Cameron Smith would be an example of that as well. So I guess the big question now becomes, what will the PGA Tour do? Will they allow him to come back, serve a suspension of 6 months, a year? Will there be some sort of path that the PGA Tour Policy Board must agree to, whether it's some money to PGA Tour charities, going to certain PGA Tour events that maybe he didn't frequent when he was a regular member of the PGA Tour? But this is a 5-time major champ, a 9-time winner on the PGA Tour, 35 years of age, and still one of those players, undoubtedly, who can move the needle in this game.
To what extent, if any at all, Damon, do you think the fact that Brooks was not a part of those original lawsuits, to what extent might that help his cause in trying to find a quicker pathway back? DeChambeau, as an example, Phil Mickelson were part of those lawsuits.
Oh, I think it's a huge part of what may be a quicker return than you might expect. I think his resume has a lot to do with that. I think he's always been, Brooks has been about Brooks, whether he's on the PGA Tour or LIV Golf. He's been about kind of going to the beat of his own drum. He's been that way since he was in college, and maybe before, kind of viewed himself as never was the first overall draft pick, as it were, didn't come to professional golf through the front door, someone who played overseas on the Challenge Tour and kind of found his way to the big stage by dint of personality, by dint of hard work, and obviously an all-world game. But I think because he didn't really kick the PGA Tour on the way out, that Brooks was more about Brooks should help, I think, smooth his way back. But there's still some question marks in terms of what the PGA Tour Policy Board will think is the proper sanction for him to come back. But make no mistake, Brooks Koepka back on the PGA Tour helps the PGA Tour and hurts LIV Golf.
How badly does it hurt LIV?
He's one of the 2 biggest names, maybe one of the 3 biggest names, if you want to say, Jon Rahm and Bryson DeChambeau as well. I think we're getting to a point in LIV Golf where it's mostly a group of has-beens and never-weres, with a handful of great players who have lost their competitive energy. Dustin Johnson, Cameron Smith, most notably. If Bryson DeChambeau, I think, is the big X factor in this story. Should Brooks Koepka find his way back to the PGA Tour sooner than later? Should he find himself welcomed back by companies and endorsements? Should he find himself winning PGA Tour events and most notably major championships? Where does that leave Bryson DeChambeau? Where does that leave Jon Rahm in terms of their happiness, comfort level at LIV Golf? I think this is, if not a death blow, potentially a rattle to LIV Golf, which, for most sports fans would not view it particularly as a serious league, more of an unserious enterprise compared to the PGA Tour, the DP World Tour, for example.
Understand what you were saying. It is a lifeline, or has been, for guys like Graham McDowell, Ian Poulter, Lee Westwood, approaching 50 years of age. I do think, in fairness, Damon, LIV has pulled some pretty good young players, guys with some upside. I'm thinking obviously about Joaquin Niemann, who's already established, but Caleb Surratt, Jose Ballester, the U.S. amateur champion from Spain, Elvis Smiley from Australia is a good young player, just signed, so not completely barren on that front. Rory made some comments recently on a podcast that Brooks and others who left for LIV had already paid a consequence, possibly reputational damage and things like that. What'd you make of what Rory said? How much validity is there in those remarks?
Yeah, I think Rory always has looked at the big picture, has tried to look at things from 30,000 feet, try to put the bruised egos aside. Clearly, whatever momentum there once was for a PGA Tour LIV merger seems to have passed, and now it's about what can the PGA Tour do to strengthen its product. And obviously there were some hurt feelings. A lot of folks left, hurt the PGA Tour, took a lot of money, and they did take and receive some reputational harm. And depending on what side of the fence you sit on, they deserve that reputational harm or not. But I think Rory looks at the big picture and says, how can we make the PGA Tour in 2026 the best product that it can be in a competitive sports market with the NFL and college football, which is, just really clearing its throat ahead of these incredible playoffs we've seen in college football and the upcoming NFL playoffs. So what can the PGA Tour to kind of strengthen its own brand and its own product? And if it means putting bruised Eagles aside and letting some big name players, one name players like Brooks back to the PGA Tour can only help the product. And I agree that, listen, LIV Golf has been more than a threat. It has taken a lot of young, talented players that would have been on the PGA Tour, but a lot of those players are playing in a vacuum, in a black hole. While they may be well paid, they are not well viewed. The numbers would tell you that not a lot of people are watching LIV Golf tournaments relative to PGA Tour events. So I think that Rory's looking at the big picture and saying, what can we do to make this product as strong as we can in a competitive sports landscape?
Yeah, I think you touched on something there. I think the issues for guys like Brooks, I don't necessarily mean to speak for him, but I've had some sources down there who are familiar with the inner workings of LIV and the players. The top line players said to me that the two big factors would be relevance. But for 4 weeks a year at the major championships and maybe the Ryder Cup, if you're John Rahm, these guys simply are out of sight, out of mind. And for guys with considerable ego, you have to have that to be a player at that level. That bothers them, that nobody to a large extent is talking about them. And the other issue is the travel. Though they play a smaller schedule, and they get 14 events, they're all over the world. I mean, they're in Adelaide, Australia, they're in Saudi Arabia, they're in South Africa, they're in South Korea. If you have a young family, as Brooks does, that's difficult. Where, as you know, Damon, you play in the United States, and if you're at Brooks's level, you're flying private. You're 3 hours away, max, 4 hours max if it's West Coast to South Florida. If you're Scotty living in the Dallas area, it's 2.5 whatever way. It's a much easier life on the PGA Tour, don't you think?
I do. I think the travel is a component of this, Rich, but I also think what you said at the top of the question, the competitive relevancy, these are CEOs of their own brand. These are folks who grew up dreaming about being on the big stage, competing against the best players in the world and being seen and hitting golf shots that are viewed and remembered and appreciated. Whether you're thinking about Tiger Woods hitting incredible, chip shots at the Masters in 2005 or at the Canadian Open over water on the 72nd hole. You want to hit shots that are memorable, that are meaningful, and that count. And when you have been Brooks Koepka, when you have been John Rahm playing on the biggest stages on the most important Sundays, and you don't have the usual run-up to those events, I think what we've seen is that the competitive pathway, and Gary Player talked about this in the early days of LIV, he was concerned about the players going over there and not having the same competitive reps, not being matched tough ahead of the Players' Championship, or in this case for the LIV golfers who can't even compete at the Players, the Masters, the PGA, the U.S. Open, and the Open Championship. While Bryson DeChambeau has been a bit of an exception, for the large part of players, for the most part, they have not kept up their competitive level pre-LIV to when they took the money and decided to compete on the LIV Golf Tour.